Hey, so today I'm going to show you how I turned this rotted log into, let me get this up here, this nice finished log. I'm going to show you how I scraped off all the bark, carved out all the rotted wood from the middle, how I sanded all of it. I also added a flat face to this just so it doesn't wobble. I'll also show you how I finished this log with some stain, 2 coats of varnish, and that's how you get, this really shiny look to it, and it adds a really nice protective coat to finished wood. I didn't have a chisel long enough to scrape out the rotted stuff, so I gathered up my tools and the log and headed over to our fire pit to do some smithing to create a chisel. Dug 2 holes. I wanted a tunnel so I could build a fire on one end and blow air through the other side. To start the fire, I just lit the newspaper on fire, dropped it in, and then what's really important for making a fire is just having some good kindling. So I added a bunch of small sticks, and then as the fire built up, I was able to add larger and larger sticks till finally some wood. After the fire finally got going, I grabbed my vacuum and I hooked it up so instead of sucking air, it would blow air. And I wanted to use the vacuum to blow air through the other side of the hole to fuel the fire with oxygen. At first it didn't work too well. The sand was spraying up and just kind of smothering the fire, but after a while I found if I put the vacuum over top of the fire, then it kind of created a vacuum, and finally there's enough air hitting the flames that got hot enough that I could actually blow through the other side of the hole. So after doing that, I put the steel rod in the hole and then carried it over to my makeshift anvil, which was just a sledgehammer in the hole. And then you can see here I'm flattening one end with the hammer. I was actually kind of surprised it worked a lot better than I thought. With that vacuum, I was able to get the steel red hot. As long as you get steel red hot, I think you can deform it pretty well. After flattening it with the hammer, I tried scraping out the rotted parts. This didn't work as well. You can see I was able to still get some of the rotted stuff off, even though it was really blunt. I got as much as I could of the loose stuff, but then I decided to give up on it. Here's some of the shavings I got. To scrape off the bark, I decided to use my hatchet. There was some tougher parts that I had to get through the wood, and so after hurting my hand trying to use it as a hammer, I finally grabbed a hammer, but it got the job done. I should sharpen my hatchet, but it worked well. The next time I do this, I'll definitely use the hammer and the hatchet all the way through. This made it a lot easier. I felt more control too. If I got into some of the wood, I could just pound through it. Yeah, you can see it. It's definitely a lot easier using the hammer. Satisfying. Once I tore the bark off, I noticed there's a bunch of strands still left on the log. I tried to get it with my machete, but this didn't work too well. So I just let the rest of the strands dry so I could get rid of them with the sander. For sanding the log, I'm using a Milwaukee palm sander. I got this for this project. I really like Milwaukee tools. They're a bit more expensive, but I like the quality. Plus, I'm from Milwaukee, so I gotta rep the brand. Here I'm using the straddling technique. I didn't have a good vise to fixture this log in place. After sanding half the log, you can see the difference. I really like this grain that started showing up. So I decided this will be the top of the Squatty Potty. I really like trying to line up these holes perfectly. They don't need to be too perfect. Some dust in my eyes. Now I'm putting this away. Just to bring it back. Voila! The log, all sanded. I used 80 grit sandpaper for sanding the log. Later I go in with some finer stuff to really smooth it down. I'm using this hand planer here to make a nice flat surface on the bottom of the log. I made a few mistakes when starting to plane this. First off, I'm not wearing eye protection. And another thing I did wrong was I didn't fixture this log in place. When you're working with tools that are more dangerous, you definitely want to make sure you're using the correct methods just so you stay safe. So don't do what I'm doing. I want to try to be a bit more safe in the future though. You can see the flat face that I'm trying to make. I was struggling to figure out how to make the log flat, so I grabbed a pane of glass and then drew a line offset from that plane, and that made it a lot easier to see how much material I had to remove on both sides. I also didn't set the depth of the planer deep enough, so you can see I ended up doing a lot more work than I needed to do. If I set the depth a little bit deeper, then I would have had to do less planing. Here's another mistake I made. I ended up straddling the log to hold it in place. This worked pretty well, but it's still not safe, and you shouldn't do this. I'm a better example of what not to do. Here I'm struggling to keep the log in place. I use some cardboard, but yeah, it just keeps falling out of place, and it definitely wasn't a good solution for fixturing it in place. In any sort of metalworking or woodworking, it is really important to fix your parts in place. It can be really dangerous if the part slips and then the saw slips, and that's how people usually end up getting cut. I just added this because I thought I looked nice. There was an edge on the log that it was tough to get with the planer, so to make a little shortcut, I decided to get the saw to make the cut. And this actually worked surprisingly well, but I'm still making the same mistake of not fixturing the log in place. It was pretty cold out, so I had some gloves on, but when you're using a planer, and I think for using hand planers, you're also not supposed to wear gloves. The glove can get caught in the spinning blade, and your hand can get sucked in and would not look pretty. It would not feel good either. Here I finally decided to set the blade deeper, and you can see the shavings coming off the log aren't as fine. they're more like strands, more like shavings off the log than sawdust. I also used an egg carton to hold the log in place. This worked a lot better than the cardboard that I had. It was really satisfying when I was able to finally get straight planes all the way through the log instead of just little cuts. The chisel, after I smithed it, wasn't that sharp, so it really wasn't able to dig into the wood to get all the rotted stuff out. I took the chisel over to a grinding wheel and put a nice edge on it. This still wasn't the sharpest, so I actually got my sharpening stone and put a nice sharp edge on it. I've messed around with different sharpening stones. This one is really easy to use. You don't need water. I was able to get some nice long shavings off. I wanted to get all this rotted wood out. I don't know if it's the worst thing in the world, but I want the log to be a bit lighter, and I think if the rot stayed on there, then the log would just keep rotting. I found as I'm pushing the blade through, if I rack the edge back and forth, I can kind of cut through a bit better than just pushing it straight through. It's definitely easier to get shavings off. This log here is oak. Here's all the shavings that came from this carving sesh. To get the log to that next level, I decided to put a nice chamfer on the edge. Here I'm using the palm sander again with 80 grit. You can see the nice curve. I also sanded the log one last time with a higher grit. This was 220. Now the log's a lot smoother, and here you can see the interesting grain on the top. This is the stain I used. It's always good to mix it. When applying stain to end grain, this is the edge of the log. It'll soak up the stain kind of like a sponge. So whenever you're putting stain on the end of the grain, it's really important to go really light with it, or your ends are going to end up darker than the sides. For staining, I like using these foam brushes. They conform to the curves on the log really nicely. I really liked how the log started to look after I got that stain on it. Now the log's looking like I envisioned in my mind. I cracked open the varnish. I tried filling in all the cracks with the varnish, but varnish is a lot thinner than epoxy, so if you're trying to fill in cracks, it might not happen. I tried to do it even with multiple coats, but I really couldn't fill in any of the cracks. Another reason why I'm using these foam brushes is because they don't produce streaks. So when applying the varnish, you should also get some foam brushes. With the varnish, you want to make sure you're applying it all in the same direction. You don't want there to be globs forming or even drops on it, because then it's going to harden and droplets on the log. So make sure you're streaking along in the same direction and not letting too much clump up in one spot. I'd suggest trying to go thin with that first layer and then just add more and more layers to build up a really nice smooth surface. Here's the log with its first coat of varnish on it. After putting the first coat of varnish on, I'm sanding it really lightly with this fine piece of sandpaper. Right now the log is a little bit rough and I'm just trying to get out some of that roughness. You don't want to sand too much or you're going to sand away that first layer. I tried to do a little bit on the edges. It was a rougher surface, so I couldn't get in some of the spots. You can see where the chainsaw left its marks. I'm glad I didn't recut them to make sure they're nice and smooth. Now the log's really smooth. I ended up wiping all the dust off with paper towel and a little bit of water. Before doing the other side, I decided to make this stand for the log. Here I'm applying that second layer of varnish. This was my final layer. You could do more layers if you want a thicker plasticky layer on it, but for me and what I wanted, this was perfect. Here's the varnish that I use. It's also called polyurethane. When you're working with it, it can get pretty sticky, so you might want to get yourself some paint thinner. Just use it when you're washing your hands in the sink. Paint thinner is pretty toxic, so you want to make sure you're using it in the sink and not using too much at one time. That's how I turned a rotted log into this nice finished log that I use for a Squatty Potty at my house. It took a while to make, but it really wasn't too much work. If you like watching people make random stuff out of wood, you should check out some of my other videos. I hope you guys have a nice day, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.